This week we are talking about Chapter 5, which is program theory. And so when we talk about program theory, it's pretty consistent with if you've ever had a class on any theory. So like psych theory or social theory or criminological theory or anything like that. It's, of course, there's differences in terms of the substance of what would constitute a crim theory versus a psych theory versus a social theory versus a theory in anthropology or something else. So the substance is going to be different. With program theory, it's slightly different in that you're not, to be able to find like a theory textbook where they're like, oh, this is the history and evolution, and this is, this well-defined theory with this author, and then there was a revision in this year. Program theory is not that straightforward, but in terms of, what constitutes a theory, what is the purpose of theory? So, you're trying to predict or explain something. Program theory is consistent with what you would think of in terms of just kind of normal theories. So when we're talking about program theory, we're talking about how whatever the desired social benefit is from the program. So remember, we talked about it doing a needs assessment. Why would this program be necessary? And then saying, okay, we need to study to what extent does this need exist? Is there a better alternative than an existing program or a proposed program? So that was all the needs assessment. Now, when we're talking about theory, there is at least hopefully an understanding that whatever the social benefit is, that it's desired, that it's needed. So a theory then says, okay, how can we best attain the social benefits that are desired? So the first step in assessing a program theory, because now we're talking about how do you look at a program theory to say, yeah, we think that we have this problem and that the way that this program is going to go about minimizing or solving that problem is the best way to go about that. The first step in figuring that out or assessing it is to actually articulate the theory. So describe the conceptions, describe the assumptions, describe the expectations that constitute the rationale for the way that the program is structured and operated. In the way that you would articulate a program theory, it should be done in such a way that you can analyze it, so that it shouldn't be some esoteric, abstract description that can't be analyzed. So looking first at the evaluability assessment perspective, you would describe the program model, and this is in your book, so I'm trying to just reinforce and better explain what's in the book. So this should be familiar to you, and you also can be looking through the book as you're listening to this, or review the book again after you hear this, and hopefully it will make sense to you. So looking at the evaluability assessment perspective, describe the program model, so what's going to constitute the program, with attention to defining what the program's goals and objectives are, and that should make sense to you. So if the program's goal is to reduce juvenile delinquency in an area, then you would want to describe the program model in that way. Like, what about the program model is going to be effective in reducing juvenile delinquency in that area? Looking at an assessment of how well defined and how evaluable the model is. So can you evaluate it? Can you look at and make connections between the activity and the desired outcome? And that might be something like, if you're saying we want to start an after-school tutoring center, so we can, working parents can continue to work, knowing that their children are cared for in a pro-social way, and that they're attaining academic benefits. So the kids work with tutors, and they have to get their homework done, and then they have structured peer playtime. Or interactive time, where, again, kids are engaging in pro-social activities, maybe athletic activities, with an emphasis given to academic stuff. So the theory behind it might be that kids are committing delinquent acts because they are bored, unsupervised, and connecting with similar others. And if that theory is accurate, then you would say, okay, if peers are able to connect with one another, but in a structured pro-social atmosphere, and there's supervision, so parents don't need to be concerned about that, that should reduce delinquency. that would be something that you can articulate that, you can measure that, you can look at the outcome, you can say, okay, this is what juvenile delinquency looked like in this area at this period of time. Now, after the implementation of the program and over time, what did delinquency look like in that area? And also you would want to look in surrounding areas, because you wouldn't want to assume that delinquency had gone down when in fact it may have just been displaced to another area. And then identification, and this is all part of evaluating and assessing a program theory. You would want to identify different stakeholder interest in the evaluation. So the goal is to seek to describe and understand. So again, it is to seek to describe and understand the program, and then you would do it through whatever method of data collection. It might be interviews, observations, surveys, possibly measuring some secondary data, although you probably wouldn't do that by itself. An evaluability assessment may reveal faults in the program's delivery. It might reveal that the target population is not well defined, or that the intervention needs to just be reconceptualized. So, if you're talking about, we're aiming to reduce juvenile delinquency, what age group are you talking about? What geographic area are you talking about? So if you're like, oh, we've got this K-5 program, and it's all set up and it's going to be great, but it's the high school kids who are committing the delinquency, you're aiming your program at the wrong target population. In terms of the program's delivery, if you say, okay, well, we're going to do structured homework time followed by athletics and peer interaction where they can do puzzles or learn a foreign language or play games or play basketball. And then you come to find out that the tutors aren't actually provided. So the kids, when they're supposed to be doing homework, there's no real monitoring to make sure they're doing homework. It's just to make sure that the kids aren't getting up or causing trouble. So if the monitoring isn't occurring and kids aren't actually doing their homework, they're sitting around playing on their phones or on Facebook or talking to each other. And then they say, okay, homework time, as long as you work for an hour, then you can go play with your friends. That's an implementation issue. And you're saying, okay, that the program's not being delivered the way it should be. If the program is supposed to be that the academics are getting the most attention, then you would assume that there are tutors and that there are people who are actually making sure that the kids' homework is complete, not that they're just sitting in a homework area doing something else. So describing program theory. The way that I think I would like you to best understand this is through the logic model. You guys have done a logic model. You've seen them in the book. You have described them in Quizlets. So hopefully by now you have an understanding of what a logic model is. There are synonyms for that: program model, outcome line, cause map, causal map. You'll see other terms, but it's basically conceptualize it the way you would a logic model. So basically you've got the program and you've got the outcome. What links? Why do they exist? So it's basically a diagram of the theory. Social program centers on transactions that occur between the program's operations and the population that it serves. So program theory looks at or includes impact theory, a service utilization plan, and a program's organizational plan. So impact theory is that the improved conditions are expected to result. The means by which the program expects to bring about its intended effects. So again, if you're talking about, we're going to have an after-school center. Okay, well, what about that? What features does that center have, and why do you expect it to be linked to a reduction in juvenile delinquency? Service utilization plan talks about the program's assumptions and expectations about how to reach the target population. So it might be something like you're assuming that the school's going to get the word out, or that parents are going to want their kids to be in the program, and that kids are going to willingly come to the place. So even if the parents assume that's where they're at, how are you going to make sure that the kids are actually there? So things, what are you assuming? What are you assuming about the problem? If you have a program for K through 8th grade, you're assuming that those kids are the ones responsible for the delinquency. So it's really important to examine the assumptions within the program also, and also, you know, the expectations about how to reach the target population. And you can depict that in a flow chart, which, like I said, I would just use the logic model. Sorry, I don't know. It seems like my camera's fuzzy or something. And then the organizational plan looks at the needs and resources of the organization that are necessary to produce the outcomes. So when you're developing the organizational plan, what building are you going to use? How are you going to come up with tutors who are qualified to work with youth? How are you going to structure the playtime? Because if you want to put, you know, kids playing basketball in an area, you're not going to want to put a quiet reading area right next to that. So just in terms of, you know, how to, what resources do you need to be able to carry out all of the elements of your program? How many people are you going to need to monitor the youth? Are you going to allow them to go outside? If you are, what boundaries are you going to put out there? And again, the supervision. So the organizational plan needs to include all of the needs and all of the resources of an organization that are necessary to produce those outcomes. And you can depict that in many ways. You can describe the objectives for the services the program will provide. You can look at what the services are, how much of them will be provided, to whom they will be provided, on what schedule. So again, that can be the presentation, and the specific issues that are addressed are just going to depend on an actual organization and what the organization's plan is. The third part of your chapter 5, talked about eliciting program theory. If a program theory is articulated ahead of time, it probably has come from an actual existing theory. So that is more, that's what we would call more like an articulated theory or an explicit theory. Implicit is if there are underlying assumptions about how the services are going to accomplish their purposes, but they haven't necessarily been articulated or recorded, then that's implicit. When we are talking about eliciting program theories, there are a couple of things to consider. One is defining boundaries, and then 2 is to explicate the theory. So when it comes to defining the boundaries, the evaluator has a lot of discretion, and part of that discretion can, and if there's and will be, if there is an evaluation sponsor, based on that evaluation sponsor. Remember, the evaluation sponsor is the person funding the evaluation, so that person has a lot of say in how the evaluation is carried out. It also can operate from the perspective of stakeholders who are expected to act on the findings. So we've talked about the role of all different kinds of stakeholders, but it's the stakeholders who are likely to actually use the findings or act on them who tend to be the most important or receive the most priority. Defining boundaries should encompass activities, events, and resources that are associated with the intended outcomes. So that can include media events, it might include publicity and marketing types of things, the resources that I mentioned before, you know, in terms of space, time, personnel, any of that stuff. All of that is going to be defined within the boundaries. Explicating the theory. If you're in the planning stage of the theory, then you can build the theory around existing research and prior practice. So in similar programs, what theoretical bases have operated, what assumptions have existed. You can look at a program structure and operation and say, okay, we've had other similar programs, and this is the theoretical basis upon which it's operated. So again, if you're in the planning stage, then you can build the theory off of existing research and practice. Programs, goals, and objectives are especially connected to impact theory. So if you're looking at what is the program's goal, and then was it accomplished, did it have an impact on whatever that intended social benefit was? So that's what that part of the book is talking about. When you're talking about the program's goals and objectives, you're talking about why should we carry the program out? What are the expected results? And how can we tell if the results are actually occurring? So if we say, okay, we want to reduce juvenile delinquency, how will you know if that reduction has happened? if you want to increase school readiness among preschoolers, how do you know that that objective happened? So that's when they're talking about programs, goals, and objectives. It's, again, being able not only to articulate them, but to be able to measure them. When you're describing a program theory, you should always integrate goal statements into the theory, because that's half of it. It's explaining why the activities are related to an outcome. And of course, the goal should hopefully be related to the outcome. The program's functions, components, and activities are determined by activities and, well, often are determined by the activities and job descriptions of the personnel. So if you want to know what comprises a program, or what is the purpose, or what activities, then you can look at the activities themselves. You can look at the personnel who are involved and what the different people who are involved in the program actually do. And then the third piece of that is the logic of the functions, activities, and components. So how are the program functions related to the outcomes? Sometimes that can be temporal. So you would expect after the program, and then you measure something like after at-risk kids or after inmates are released from a certain program, what was the outcome? And that would be a temporal one, so one that's time-oriented. And then others are related to activities or events that have to be coordinated. And then sometimes the link is just conceptual, and your book gives an example of that. And that's just where there's kind of an implicit assumption that knowledge about something is going to lead to a behavior change. So by exposing people to information about the harmful effects of smoking, that's going to lead them to smoke a lot less. Or, once we kind of destroy the myth, if there's some program or campaign designed to destroy the myth that low fat is a healthy diet, then you expect that once people receive that knowledge, that they will change their behavior based on that. So you might expect to see a reduction in the purchase of low-fat food, or if you administered a survey to people, you would expect them to report less consumption of low-fat food. Assessing program theory. This is usually done in conjunction with process or impact evaluation. We are going to be doing process and impact evaluation. Your paper has a theoretical component. It's what you've been working on. We are not doing a formal program theory evaluation. Already we took on a huge amount this semester, so I didn't want to incorporate a third type of evaluation, but I did have you include the logic model and the theoretical piece. You're going to do a very informal cost-benefit analysis. So you're definitely going to be exposed to actually doing these things, but it's just going to be less formal than the other stuff. Assessing program theory. Again, the assessment is usually done in relationship to the social needs. You need to be very specific. You need to have a very solid understanding of what the social problem is that you're trying to remedy. Look for disconnect between the theory and the program. So when you're assessing program theory, that is the purpose, to make sure that what you are looking at is consistent, that the logic model makes sense, and that any disconnects are identified. You are also assessing logic and plausibility. And sometimes the assessment can have a panel of reviewers. Other times it's just a single evaluator, or sometimes it's an evaluator with a research team. Sometimes it might be a good idea to have outside experts who have no relationship to the program. Looking at the assessment of logic and plausibility, that can be a very open-ended type of assessment. Just looking at things like, are the program's goals and objectives well-defined? Are the goals and objectives feasible? To say, we're going to eliminate gang activity in Detroit, probably not feasible, especially as a short-term goal. So are they well-defined? Are they feasible? Is the change process presumed in the program theory plausible? Are the procedures for identifying members of the target population, are those well-defined? Are they sufficient? Are the components and activities and functions of a program well-defined and sufficient? And once you have all that figured out, are the resources there adequate to accomplish what you want to accomplish? You can assess program theory through comparing with existing research and practice. So look at program evaluations based on similar concepts. You can look at existing literature on a topic. And then you also can assess a program by preliminary observation. So just an evaluator observing the program during its operation, talking to the staff, talking to the program recipients. Interviews might be conducted. The evaluator might examine the circumstances of the target population. The evaluator can ask questions about the program's activities and the supporting resources to determine if there is a problem with the implementation or if the problem is with the theory, assuming a problem exists. So you have a number of possible outcomes of program theory assessment. If there are program deficiencies, then a program can be reconceptualized. So this isn't an all or nothing proposition where you're like, whoa, you don't have a good theory, or the logic model, like there's a complete disconnect in this part of it, abandon what you've been doing. It's not that black and white. Sometimes if there are deficiencies, a program can be reconceptualized. It might be an issue of something like just clarifying the goals and objectives. It might involve restructuring one or more components of a program. If there's an issue with the intended activities not happening, or if the intended activities just aren't needed. It might involve working with stakeholders to obtain consensus about the logic that connects the activities with the outcome. So, depending on the outcome or the outcome of the theoretical assessment, a number of different actions can be taken. A couple of extra notes, and your book didn't talk about this stuff. When you're talking about impacts of a program, the impacts can be positive, but they also can be negative. So if you have this proposed theory, even something like Scared Straight, and you're like, okay, this is the goal of the Scared Straight program. It's to scare kids into not doing drugs. So you implement this Scared Straight program or something like it, and maybe part of it has an unintended impact, like it traumatizes a child, or it makes kids less likely to open up to adults, or something like that. So the impact can be positive, or you can say, okay, well, it didn't have the desired positive impact, but it's also important to look for unintended negative impacts of programs or parts of it. The theory can provide the conceptual framework for monitoring or evaluating, a useful way to bring together existing information about a program, clarifying whether there's disagreement or agreement about how a program is understood to work and where there are gaps in the evidence. And then finally, a program theory can be developed by program staff, evaluator, program designers, or collaboratively with the communicator. So there's not a rule saying, oh God, sorry about that. My stupid dog. She scared the crap out of me. There's no rule saying, ideally, the person who came up with the program or the idea should have some theoretical basis for it. But in terms of articulating it and figuring out what to evaluate and how, that can be done ahead of time by the creator of a program or a stakeholder, or it can be done later on by the evaluator. I'm sorry, I actually did one more thing. Processes to develop program theory. So if a theory does need to be developed, whether it is prior to a program being developed or as the program is being implemented, there are a number of processes that occur, and your book does not talk about these. So this is just kind of supplemental material. Articulate mental models. So in individuals or in groups with key informants, can do this just kind of in terms of a mental model of how they understand an intervention is going to work. A process called backcasting is a second way, and this is where you work backward from whatever the desired future is, and then work backward from that to the present. Another approach is the 5 whys, so WHYS, and this involves asking questions to examine cause and effect relationships that create underlying problems. Another one is to just start with generic theories. Another one is group model building, and that is basically to just get into a group and develop a logic model. And a lot of times this is actually done using like a whiteboard or even sticky notes that can be moved around. And that actually that's fairly widely used and can be pretty effective. I mentioned before using previous research and evaluation, and then something called the SWOT analysis, which is SWOT, and that is reflecting on and assessing the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So SWOT is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of a particular strategy to discover how it can best be implemented. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I know I tend to speak a little bit quickly sometimes, so if I went a little bit too fast for you, just let me know. I'm happy to provide you with notes or additional dialogue or other resources, anything that can be helpful. I hope this stuff is making sense to you. You should have a pretty good understanding of a needs assessment and a program theory evaluation. And I will be in touch soon about our Children's Outreach Project evaluation. I hope everyone is doing great and having a wonderful semester so far. Please get in touch with me if you have any questions or if you need anything. Otherwise, I will be in touch with you guys very soon.